people will catch on and start to realize, well, you're probably going to catch this thing if if you come into contact with the sick. And unfortunately, people stop taking care of those who are sick because they themselves don't want to get sick with this. The dead pile up. In fact, one of the most profitable things you can do at the time during this whole entire ordeal was you were a collector of the dead. They paid pretty darn good wages to individuals who disposed of the dead bodies, because once people found out that you could get sick from the people who were infected and those who had died, nobody went near them. Nobody wanted to touch them. They left them right where they were when they died. And, you know, people were walking around and they dropped down in the streets, and that's where they died. And that's where they decomposed. In the middle of the summer in Europe, medieval Europe, where you have the conditions I explained already, with terrible sanitation conditions, and on top of that, decomposing dead bodies in the middle of the street. It must have looked like the apocalypse. And there are paintings and drawings and things of this time period, you know, that resemble just that. People thought the end was coming. Doctors, obviously at the time, were also used, and you know, they had treatments, which they thought were treatments at the time. One of the things that is common, that some of you might know already, is that they wore what was called a plague mask. All right, and I'll just take it off so you can see it a little closer here. They had a plague mask, and it was like a bird beak, right, that had eyes, and you would put it over your face. And why did they do this? A lot of times they would put spices inside of the beak itself because they were in conditions where it was very smelly, and they were covering their face as well, right? And so they had plague masks, right, that look like this. So that is interesting. Also, you should know that as people caught on that if you had it, or you knew people who had it and they were at their homes, the places of residence would start to get marked with a red or a black cross. And that cross meant that this is a dwelling place of a person who was or is infected with the plague. Don't go in there. Stay clear. All right, and so they marked it. They started to mark the sick. So you can start to see that they're starting to catch on and that they're starting to take precautionary measures. They're self-isolating, right, socially distancing. They're marking the people of the infected. And these techniques will start to lower the rate of the infection. Many people will move. They'll just leave. Especially the wealthy people in the cities. They will go to their country homes, right? Other people will just leave as well, and they'll go live in the countryside. So people abandon the cities, and some cities become ghost towns. There's nobody living in them because everybody knows that now, if you're close to the dead and the infected, you yourself could get infected and die. And so they leave, and they go to the countryside. Some towns and villages and cities were completely abandoned and never rebuilt and never reoccupied. And if you were a traveler going through the area after the plague, and you happened to be stumbling upon one of these villages, you would go there, and there would be nobody there at all. Maybe they had died. Maybe they had moved. But you would go into these buildings, and it was very eerie. They had still their tables set, ready to eat, utensils out, plates all set to go, and they just decided to leave then. Or there were, you know, evidence of people who had left, that were living there and just had vanished, just had left. So they looked like ghost towns. People just vanished. And, you know, and that's the way it was. They fell into ruin, and some of them were completely abandoned and destroyed and forgotten about. Like I said, people moved to the countryside and they socially distanced, right? So there's something that they did that we're doing here to mitigate infection, and the social distance thing is, it is an effective thing, and it was effective for them as well. And I already mentioned these things. Nobody wanted to touch the dead, so they piled up. So just how destructive was the plague in Europe? Well, it's not precise. The numbers aren't 100% precise here, but most estimates are roughly around half of the population of Europe died. And some estimates are higher, and I would imagine localized in some areas, it could have been higher. Some estimated lower, closer to 0.25%, but I would say anywhere between 25 and 50% of the population of Europe died with localized heavier amounts. Right? Sounds like the Weather Channel. Right? Localized heavier amounts, yeah. In this case, the dead from the plague. So I drew this graph. I didn't print it out, but I figure I'd draw it out here. And what you should know is, it starts around 1350 or so, and in around 1350, the population was roughly around 80 million people in Europe. In a few years, we're talking just, 5-ish years or so, that population declines to 60 million people. And in some estimates, that number is lower, and the population of Europe was higher. This is just one of the examples I found online. And what I wanted to show you is how stark of a decline it was in just such a limited period of time. And in order for the population to recover, it took about 200 years for that population to get back to where it was pre-plague. What you need to understand also is that the plague was not over and done with after the year of 1353. Most of the plague was. But the plague would linger on. People became smart about the plague. They implemented these socially distancing policies relatively quickly, and so it never spread to the rate that it had previously, because they were very proactive, because they now had the knowledge about the plague. So they would mark the homes of those that were infected, and they would stay clear from them. And so you do have, throughout the medieval world, small flare-ups of the plague occurring. Right? But the big one was in the middle of the 1300s. So then, what was the outcome of the plague on medieval society? The outcome is, again, about roughly half of the population of Europe died, and cities were the place where the highest number of people had died. You should know that trade declined. There just wasn't a demand anymore because, one, not many people were working. They were just trying to survive. And two, everybody was dead. So, you didn't have a demand because there was nobody left alive to demand anything. With fewer people alive, consequently, labor became more important. And so people who were alive and they were laborers, they were in a better position to negotiate their salaries and their working conditions, because, again, during this time period, everything had to be done by hand. There weren't factories kicking out, tools and products, but also the fields had to be sown, they had to be plowed. And so farmers as well, serfs as well as peasants, they now were in a good position to where they themselves could get better treatment. They could argue for better treatment. And they did. So their wages increased. All right? So trade declined, but wages increased because labor was competitive. If you were a serf, you'd say, oh, you want me to work for you? Well, that guy down over there, he says he's going to give me X amount of money. What are you going to give me? All right? And these nobles and people who own the farmland, they want to see their crops being sown. They want to be making money off that land. They don't want it to just go to waste and become overgrown, and they'd have to chop down all the trees that are grown there again. And so they wanted it to be productive, so they had to pay higher wages. And ultimately, guys, this is going to be one of the things that leads to the collapse of feudalism. It's going to limit the power of the lords because the people will start to gain more power, and so the lords will lose control over their hold on the people. Plus, there wasn't as many people left alive, so regional nobles become weaker, but kings of entire countries become stronger. So central governments will become stronger. Regional powers like the lords and ladies will grow weaker, and the people will, for a time, have better treatment and wages. And in a nutshell, guys, that's a little bit about the plague for you. Um, I'm sure there's a lot more that I can tell you about the plague, but for now, that's going to be it. So, with that said, we find ourselves in a unique situation where things are kind of similar in a certain way, just nowhere near as deadly, right? But socially distancing is something that worked then. It is something that works now. Hopefully, this thing will be done and over with sooner than later, and that will come up with the treatment. But for now, do as history tells us to do and what is effective, and that's all we can hope for. So, with that said, please continue to be safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you for the next one. All right, take care.